Hi, I'm Chris Adkin. In this session, I'm going to talk about building data lakes with S3. Quick Data Lake 101. The whole idea is that we get away from this world of ETL, which we've been mired in. We get away from spending inordinate amounts of time writing ETL packages, having data flying around all over the place. We make things much simpler by going from the world of ETL to ELT. So we land our data in a lake, and then we curate our data, we cleanse the data, enrich the data, and then get it to a state where it's fit to be presented to an upstream tool, which usually is something which gives us the ability to query the data using SQL. So this could be Azure Synapse Analytics, Redshift, Snowflake, something pretty much like that. And by doing this, we get away from moving data around. The key takeaway to all of this is that we need object storage. If you come from the world of Azure, you'll be familiar with the fact that you need either Azure Blob Storage or Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage. If, however, you come from the world of AWS, you want to do something with an on-premises appliance, you want to use a cloud that is not Azure, the chances are that you'll be working with S3. So what is S3? So S3 stands for Simple Storage Service. It originated at AWS. It was AWS's first storage as a service platform. Stuff on S3 is immutable, so you can either create or delete files. You have this thing called a bucket or buckets. I'll be talking about buckets a lot because buckets are absolutely key and fundamental to S3. In short, a bucket it's both a namespace and a security boundary. Objects can be organized via prefixes, and under the covers S3 uses HTTP and HTTPS. To draw a straight line between S3 and things in the Azure world, S3 is more comparable to Azure Blob Storage than it is to Azure Data Lake Storage. So if you're using S3 in AWS, by default, data is highly available across all zones in a region. You can make it available across regions, but that's not the default behavior. In AWS, S3 supports lifecycle policies, tiering based on access frequency, event notifications, which I'll come on to, which is important for data pipelines. Access control is via access control list and AWS identity access management. And finally, S3 supports object versioning. There's different flavors of S3. So despite the fact that when a lot of people talk about S3, they'll automatically follow that up by mentioning AWS. You can use S3 in a variety of places. So there's software-defined platforms, there's things like Mini.io and LocalStack. If you want to spin up an environment to play around with on your laptop, they're the easiest options, also the cheapest options. The public cloud, obviously, with things like AWS, but you also have Google Cloud, OVH Cloud, DigitalOcean. And then finally, most storage vendors that ship hardware appliances will ship a hardware appliance that supports S3. So the takeaway here is that there's a wide number of places where you can run S3 other than AWS. However, the big gotcha here is that AWS is the gold standard for S3, and because it's the gold standard, what that means is is that if you find somewhere else where you can use it, you might find that other place, wherever that might be, only supports a subset of what AWS S3 gives you. So just be aware of that. Some S3 fun facts. AWS was AWS's first storage service to hit production was S3. It's used by likes of Netflix, Wikipedia, New York Times. It's the world's most popular object storage standard. That's not to denigrate anything from Azure and Microsoft. That's just by virtue of the fact that S3 has been around so long. Also, it's available on premises. Also, it's available in multiple clouds. It's designed to handle to scale billions of objects, and most big data tools that have got any kind of traction, including things like Kafka and Spark, support S3. A myth doing the rounds is that S3 is slow. For sure, if you're interested in low latency, S3, it's not the storage platform for you. But if you're interested in high I/O bandwidth, it absolutely can be. And when I say can be, the reason I use the word can is because you've got to pay careful consideration if you're using S3 and AWS as to what you do with prefixes. The takeaway point here is the best possible performance. You use as many prefixes per bucket as possible, ideally one per file and object. And by doing that, you get the best possible put, copy, post, delete performance that AWS can give you. There's some blazingly fast hardware appliances out there as well also, but this is a particular nuance of using S3 in the AWS cloud. So how does S3 compare to Azure Blob Storage? Well, with Azure Blob Storage, the Azure Cloud, you start off with a subscription. That in turn maps to one or more storage accounts, which in turn maps to one or more blob containers. In the world of S3, you have a much flatter structure. You have an AWS account, and then you create a bucket in a region. Responding to events. So when people talk about S3, if you're looking at S3 architecture diagrams, what you'll often come up with seeing is people that do things with AWS Lambda functions. So a Lambda function is similar to an Azure function, and in essence, what you do is you say, when you create your bucket or after the event, you want notifications to be generated. These can be picked up via Lambda functions. Your Lambda function in turn can then trigger off a data pipeline. And if you come from the Azure world, you'll be familiar with the fact that with Azure Blob Storage, you can send notifications to Event Hub, and that can trigger off Azure Functions, Logic Apps, Azure Automation Runbooks, and it can also fire off webhooks. Again, in the AWS S3 world, things tend to be a bit flatter. However, the takeaway point is if you want event triggered data pipelines, you can absolutely facilitate that with S3 in AWS via notifications and Lambda functions. So let's look at creating an S3 bucket. So this is the console. I've got 2 buckets already. Let's go ahead and create one. So we need a region. I'm going to choose the one closest to London. I'll give my bucket a name. Scroll down, there's a number of advanced options. We're going to go for the defaults. note the things which are enabled and disabled by default. So our bucket's there. What we now need to do is we now need to arrange access to our bucket. And in the world of S3, irrespective of whether you're using the public cloud or an appliance or a software-defined platform, you need an access key ID, access key secret pair. So we're going into the IAM console. We're creating an access key for the user I've got set up. And whenever you're accessing your bucket, you will need to provide these two things. So making buckets secure. By default, when you create a bucket, only you, the creator, owner of the bucket, can see what's inside that. You can, however, you can grant access to other users in your account or used in different accounts. In the AWS account, you can use IAM to strict bucket access to IP address ranges. By default, public access to your buckets is blocked. For the purpose of this session, this is probably what you want. However, if you were hosting static content for a website in S3, anybody accessing your website, they're not going to be able to see that content unless they've got public access to your bucket. And security has ramifications for how you design your data lake in terms of buckets. So again, this is the basic layout of a data lake at the highest level of abstraction. And you can start off simply by putting everything in a single bucket. Now that will absolutely work from a functional point of view. However, you can then go on and refine this by having one bucket per zone or area. But what you really need to consider is security. So imagine you're a large organization listed on, say, for example, the New York Stock Exchange. If somebody leaked out your sales data ahead of you announcing your results to the security commission, you could get in trouble with them. You could be fined quite heavily. So you might also have data from, say, marketing campaigns. You might host a number of webinars. You want to record what sort of numbers of people attended from what parts of the world. You might want to perform analytics on the number of leads that a particular marketing campaign generated. For sure, you don't want your competitors getting hold of that, but at the same time, if information gets out prematurely, you're not going to get punished by the Securities Commission. Okay, so what you might want to do is, as per this diagram here, is split your data between different buckets, and by doing this, you can have different levels of security. When you get to the data in the presentation zone, it might be aggregated, enriched, cleansed in such a way that if it was to get out into the public, it can't be presented in such a form that's going to result in your company being fined. So in this case, you might be able to get away with a single bucket for the presentation zone, which is where something like Snowflake or some other scale-out cloud-based database platform is going to scoop up the data. I'm now going to talk about a number of tools that you can use, and these are all freely available. If you're using AWS, you can absolutely use the console, you can use the AWS CLI. However, what I want to do is I want to give you the means of using AWS no matter which cloud you're using, no matter which hardware appliance you're using, no matter which software defined platform you're using. So first up, we have this thing called S5 CMD. I mention this because it's a simple CLI tool, which is also the fastest tool around for playing around with S3 data per this graph here. Let's have a quick look at what S5 CMD looks like in a demo. So we need a credentials file. This is usually stored in the AWS directory of our home directory. Your credentials file stores your access key and access key secret pair. Once you've got that, we can list what buckets we've got. So let's have a look at the one we created in the first demo. There's nothing in there. Let's create a simple chris.txt file. And let's copy it. Let's copy that file to our bucket. Okay, you can see we've now got that the chris.txt file in our bucket. We can then go ahead and remove the file. Okay. So this is S5 CMD. This is how simple it is to use. You just set up your credentials file, you just download and install the tool, and bang, you are off to the races. Next up is a GUI tool, and again, you can use the AWS console, but again, I want to give you the means of using tools that you can use to achieve your end goals, no matter whether you're in the public cloud, on premises, or using a software-defined platform. So again, this is free. Use it on Windows. I use it on Mac OS. Okay, let's have a look at what this looks like. This is how you set your connection up. You need to provide a URL, access key, ID, and secret. I've already got one of these set up. Let's have a look at our DPS bucket. Nothing in there. Okay, so let's rectify that. Copy a file to our bucket via S5 CMD. Let's go back into CyberDuck. Okay, refresh, and bang, our file is there. And you can download the file. And once it's downloaded, you can open it up using the text editor of your choice. Next up, a free Python SDK for AWS, which you can use with S3 anywhere. This is called Botto3. I'm going to show you how this works in a simple demo. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the Tweetio API to get tweet text from Twitter. If you want to do this, you need to sign up for a Twitter developer account. That gives you this thing called a bearer token, which you need to leverage the API. We're going to get a bunch of tweets based on a query. We're going to sentiment score those. We're going to put them in a data frame, and then we're going to divide that up and then store that as a number of CSV files in an S3 bucket. So this is our bucket. There's nothing in there to begin with. Let's have a look at our Python code. Okay, so this dump to S3 function. This is the bit which calls the Botto3 code specifically to create a connection to S3 and store our CSV file inside the bucket. Okay. I've got a simple shell script. Let's have a look at that. Okay, so this calls a container, containerize my code, and I'll explain exactly why I've done that. We have a Docker file which builds our container. Let's run that. Okay, let's go back into the AWS console. We have a bunch of files there. Let's open one of those up. And then we can see we have a bunch of tweets. We have the Twitter IDs, the tweet, the text. And if you were to scroll across, you'd see some numbers which relate to the sentiment scoring. So this is all very good. This is all cool, funky, brilliant. But where does this fit into the world of Microsoft? You might be forgiven for thinking, well, all this stuff you've spoken about, Chris, this would be great, but it'd be more at home at an AWS conference. So let me go through a very simple data pipeline, and what should become apparent is why S3 is going to be a thing in in the world of Microsoft, or a much bigger thing later on this year. So we need to get data into a landing zone. You can do this however you see fit. Streaming tools such as Kafka, however, are highly popular for doing this, as are things such as Spark for wrangling your data and getting it into an enriched, cleansed state. Then, using SQL Server 2022 via some very cool stuff that the SQL Server engineering tool have done with Polybase, what you can actually do is you can query data directly from S3. And you can do that via two means. You can do that via an external table, or you can do that via a query using Open Row Set. Whichever way you choose, you need to enable Polybase. You need to create a database scope to credential, then a data source. If you're using Open Row Set, you can just go ahead and run a query. If you want to use an external table, you need to in addition, you need to create an external file format and then create your external table. But this absolutely works. I've tested this out with the latest CTP, and this works wonderfully well. So if for whatever reason you have data in S3 and you want to make that available in the world of Microsoft, you can now absolutely do this. For a while, you've been able to use Azure Data Factory of AWS S3 and also Google Cloud dialect of S3. Once SQL Server 2022 goes GA, it's available in public preview form. More and more of the world of Microsoft will be opened up to S3. So before I close, let me wrap up with some useful resources. You've got the AWS guide to what S3 is. You've got a link to where S5 CMD can be downloaded from, a link to where CyberDuck can be downloaded from, and then a link to the Python code that I demoed for downloading tweets, sentiment scoring the tweets, and then finally storing them in an S3 bucket in CSV file form. Special thanks to Microsoft supporting Data Platform Geeks, SQL Server Geeks, and the Data Platform Summit in general. I'm Chris Adkin. If for any reason you want to reach out to me on Twitter, my Twitter handle is ChrisAdkin8. Please thank the organisers of the event virtually. If you're on Twitter, if you're in India, you know these people. You rub shoulders with them. Please also thank them in person. Thanks ever so much. That brings this session to a conclusion.